What's up, everybody? I hope you're all well. iOS 17 just dropped, and as usual, we're going to be doing our yearly battery test comparing iOS 17 to iOS 16 on all iPhone generations from the XR all the way up to the 14, as well as the SE models. Battery life of major iOS updates is a pretty popular concern for many, especially for those that use iPhones that are a few years old, so we're going to be putting that to the test today. So a couple things to go over real quick about how I performed this test. So I conducted this test over the course of 2 days with the very same iPhones for the iOS 16 test and the iOS 17 test. I first performed this test on iOS 16 on the first day, and then I updated all these phones to iOS 17 and performed the exact same test again the next day on the very same iPhones on iOS 17. And I'm currently showing both of these tests to you right now with the iOS 17 test up top and the iOS 16 test below. And once again, it's the very same iPhones for both the iOS 17 test and the iOS 16 tests with the very same batteries, the very same silicon, the very same everything. All these iPhones for both the iOS 17 test and the iOS 16 test are connected to the very same Wi-Fi network and the very same cellular network, but Wi-Fi will be on and connected throughout this entire test. The brightness is set as close to the same as I could get on all these iPhones, and I didn't alter the brightness whatsoever between these two tests. And the media volume is turned all the way down on all of them as well. Also, True Tone, Night Shift, and Auto Brightness are disabled on all these iPhones. And in terms of battery health, all these iPhones have batteries that are in decent condition that aren't heavily degraded or in bad shape. And alright, so with all iPhones charged up to 100% for both tests, we're going to go ahead and kick things off by turning off the power strip that they're connected to. We'll unplug the cables, and we're going to kick things off with 1 hour of YouTube video streaming. So we're going to stream the very same YouTube video on all these devices for both tests at 1080p quality, full screen for 1 hour. And checking in after that hour is complete, you can see here, all the devices basically for both tests lost more or less the same amount of percentage on iOS 16 compared to iOS 17. So not a whole lot to report on here so far, which is good. So we're going to move on to 1 hour of web browsing in mobile Safari, of course. So we're just going to be loading new web pages and scrolling through web pages on both apple.com for the first 30 minutes and theverge.com for the second 30 minutes. And checking in after a full hour of web browsing, you can see here, same thing to report here. Very negligible amount of difference between the percentages lost on iOS 16 and iOS 17, just 1 or 2 percent points here or there for some of the devices. So again, looking very good so far, looking very even between these two iOS versions. So we're going to move on to 1 hour of Instagram. So we're just going to be scrolling through posts for a solid hour. And something else very important to consider when watching battery tests like this and interpreting the results of them is these tests like this, when you're just draining iPhones, from fully charged to fully dead all at once in one sitting, are not at all representative of how most people use their phones in day-to-day life. I mean, there's so many variables like standby time when your phone's just asleep on a table or in your pocket, moving around throughout your day to different locations with, varying levels of cell signal strength, Wi-Fi strength, different temperatures of different environments you're in. Of course, that affects the battery and how it performs. Nobody is using their phones the way, I am right now, just draining them from beginning to end, without turning the screen off at all. What you can really hope to get out of videos like this is just kind of an overall reassurance that there isn't any major red flags in terms of, a new software update coming out for your iPhone. And I make these videos in large part just to reassure you guys that, you can update your iPhone to the latest iOS version and not really have to worry too much about, seeing a large drop in battery performance. Apple is historically in the past several years been very good about, not hitting the old devices with a huge, battery performance downgrade with a major software update. It's been very good for the last several years. And so far with this test, as you're seeing, it's looking pretty good so far. And anyways, checking in after a full hour of scrolling through Instagram posts, you can see here, yet again, same thing to report. Basically same results on both iOS versions. So next up, we're going to move on to TikTok. So we're going to be doing 1 hour of scrolling through TikTok posts. But yeah, iOS 17 finally out to the public. Let me know down below in the comments section what your guys' favorite feature that you're looking forward to using that iOS 17 is bringing to the table. Personally, I really like the new live voicemail feature that allows you to actually see transcribed a voicemail coming in as someone is leaving it to you through a phone call. You can even pick up the phone, as you're seeing that transcription being live in front of you. That's something that we had, long before even cell phones, just on answering machines, that we've kind of lost with cell phones, which is kind of, the opposite of how things normally go. So it's cool to see that, being brought back with iOS 17. Also, of course, just interactive widgets, being able to, check off reminders, play, pause music, right from the home screen. That's going to be really nice. And checking in after a full hour of scrolling through TikTok posts, for the most part, same trends are observed here. However, the iOS 17 iPhone 13 dropped 4 percentage points more than the iOS 16 iPhone 13. And the iOS 16 iPhone SE2 dropped 6 percentage points more than the iOS 17 iPhone SE2. But I want to make it very clear that, a difference this minor should not be interpreted as anything but, random variables that we can't control, because consistently these two devices throughout, all the previous things we've just done in this test, they performed the exact same basically on these two iOS versions. So it's very important when interpreting the results of a battery test like this to look at how the devices have been performing throughout the entire test, at each check-in point, rather than just taking one instance where it performed better on one iOS version than the other and making like a blanket statement that the battery life is worse on this iOS version than the other one, because that's not the case. There's a lot of factors in these tests that, even in a hyper-controlled test environment like this, that you just can't account for, whether it be background processes that, just happen to be running at any given time, or just different content that I'm loading in these, applications. Again, like I said, I recorded this test over the course of 2 days, so different videos, different content was in TikTok throughout that time, so there's just variables, that can throw off a device a few percentage points here or there. And you shouldn't read too much into that, especially if it's just a one-off, for a couple times in a test. Obviously, when you start to see something consistently happening throughout a variety of different tasks, that's when you can start to, make a generalized statement. But anyways, we're moving on to 1 hour of playing Minecraft now. And of course, all the graphics settings for Minecraft are set to the exact same on all devices here for both tests. And how I'm doing this is for the first 30 minutes, I'm going to be interacting with this game on the 3 newest devices, and for the second 30 minutes, I'm going to be interacting with this game on the 4 older devices. That way, all the devices get the same amount of, app interaction in the game versus it just sitting there with the game open. Of course, I only have so many fingers, so I can only interact with so many iPhones at a given time, especially like playing a game like this. So I just made sure everything was even, and did the best that I could. Anyways, checking in after a full hour of playing Minecraft, you can see here, most devices here, just lost the same amount of percentage pretty much on both iOS versions, give or take a few percentage points, except for the iOS 17 iPhone 13, which lost 5 more percentage points than the iOS 16 iPhone 13. Now, I would not read anything into this because, for the majority of the previous testing rounds that we've done in this video and the remaining ones that you're going to see in a second, this result is not consistent. So even though the iOS 16 iPhone 13 here has, a 10% point advantage over the iOS 17 iPhone 13 at this point in the test, it's only a result of there being, a random discrepancy in this round and the previous round of TikTok. So you'll see what I mean as the test progresses here. But yeah, we're going to move on here to 1 hour of playing PUBG on all devices. And shortly after launching up PUBG here, you can see the iPhone SE2 on iOS 16 is the first device to die at 5 hours and 5 minutes into the test. And just a little while later, the iPhone SE2 on iOS 17 also dies at 5 hours and 21 minutes into the test. So the iPhone SE2 performed very well on iOS 17 throughout this test. You could see pretty much no difference between iOS 16 and iOS 17 battery performance on this device. I wouldn't interpret a difference of, 15 minutes as anything other than just, negligible little variables, in these tests fluctuating. And a little while later, at 5 hours and 30 minutes into the test, the iPhone XR on iOS 17 dies. And just 6 minutes later, the iPhone XR on iOS 16 dies next at 5 hours and 36 minutes into the test. So once again, the iPhone XR performed great in this test. Very similar battery performance on iOS 17 versus iOS 16. And a little while later, the iOS 17 iPhone SE3 is the next device to die at 5 hours and 55 minutes into the test. And just 5 minutes later, the iPhone SE3 on iOS 16 dies next at 6 hours into the test. So yet again, great performance on the iPhone SE3 on both iOS versions. Nothing really to report on there, no difference. And alright, we'll close out the remainder of this hour of playing PUBG. And checking in after that, you can see the amount of percentage lost for each device on both iOS versions here is basically the same. It's completely level, just give or take a few percentage points. And you can see there the iPhone 13 is back to losing the same amount of percentage throughout this hour. So again, it's very important to look at how much was lost rather than just the percentage, because if you were to just look at the current battery percentage of the iOS 17 iPhone 13 versus the iOS 16 iPhone 13, you'd think there was, this global huge advantage that iOS 16 has. But again, when you look at how much was lost after each check-in, you start to realize a couple random factors in just a few rounds of a test can, throw off the results. So again, it's important to kind of pay attention throughout these entire tests. But anyways, with the first round of the battery test complete, we're going to head back to YouTube for our second scheduled hour of video streaming. Once again, very same video, 1080p quality for another hour. And 6 hours and 41 minutes into the test, the iOS 16 iPhone 11 is the next device to die. And just a little while later, at 6 hours and 57 minutes into the test, the iOS 17 iPhone 11 also dies. So following the trend of all the previous devices that have died, in this test, very similar on the iPhone 11 as well. And checking in after the second scheduled hour of YouTube video streaming, you can see here similar performance on all three of these devices that are remaining for both iOS versions, losing roughly the exact same amount, just give or take a percentage point or two. Anyways, next up, we're going to move on to our second scheduled hour of web browsing. Once again, doing the exact same thing as earlier, we're going to be loading new web pages and scrolling through web pages on both apple.com and theverge.com. And 7 hours and 54 minutes into the test, the iOS 16 iPhone 12 is the next device to die. And closing out the remainder of our second hour of web browsing, checking in here, you can see the devices, all the devices on both iOS versions lost a very similar amount of percentage here, with the iPhone 12 and iPhone 13 on iOS 17 just barely hanging on, both being at 3%. So next up, we're going to move on to TikTok, and 8 hours and 21 minutes into the test, the iOS 17 iPhone 13 is the next device to die. And I just want to reiterate one more time, I know a lot of you might look at this result and think the iPhone 13 on iOS 17 has worse battery life than iOS 16. I would not say that is the case at all. If you look back at how much it lost, during each check-in, it was just 2 rounds where it, lost a little bit more that threw it considerably in terms of, the amount of percentage remaining for the remainder of the test. But again, if you looked at just how much was being subtracted after each round, it was mostly very consistent between these two iOS versions. I hope that makes sense. I just want to make that very clear because I think a lot of people jump to conclusions during videos like this by not interpreting the results completely correctly. But you can see here, next up, the iPhone 12 on iOS 17 dies just a few minutes later at 8 hours and 27 minutes into the test. And checking in after our second hour of scrolling through Instagram, you can see here for the iPhone 14, similar amount of percentage lost, give or take a few percentage points on both, with the iPhone 13 on iOS 16 still hanging on at 8%. So we're going to move on to our second scheduled hour of scrolling through TikTok, and 9 hours and 56 minutes into the test, the iOS 16 iPhone 13 dies, leaving the iPhone 14 as the only device remaining in both tests. So checking in after that second scheduled hour of TikTok, you can see here they both lost the same amount of percentage, minus 1 percent point. So let's move on to our second scheduled hour of playing Minecraft. And 10 hours and 24 minutes into the test, the iOS 16 iPhone 14 dies. And a little while later, at 10 hours and 47 minutes into the test, the iOS 17 iPhone 14 dies, completing this test. So guys, at the end of the day, what I've taken away from this is you should have no concerns whatsoever about updating any of your devices to iOS 17 in regards to battery performance. I have seen nothing throughout this video that has led me to believe that there is any sort of disadvantage with battery life on iOS 17. Of course, keep in mind, there's a lot of things that tests like this don't account for, as I said earlier, like standby time, moving around throughout your day to different locations, cell signal strength, varying throughout just moving around, and a whole host of other things. But again, throughout what we've done in this video, I have not seen anything to, give me any sort of concerns about battery life on iOS 17. And again, in regards to the result on the iPhone 13 being so different, in case anybody just skipped to the end and is confused by that, that is not a consistent result that was shown throughout the entire test. There was just a few rounds where there was most likely a few random variables that caused the iOS 17 iPhone 13 to drain a bit more battery than the iOS 16 iPhone 13. But for all the rest of the test, the iOS 16 and the iOS 17 iPhone 13 lost around the same amount of battery each round of the test. Again, it's important to not just look at the final numbers and make a blanket, interpretation based on that. You gotta, look at the test results as they come in throughout the entire test to really get an idea of, interpreting these results accurately. And guys, that just about wraps it up for this video. I hope this was helpful to you, or just entertaining at the very least. A lot more exciting content coming up very soon with the iPhone 15 coming out. You know, by the time you're watching this, iPhone 15 will be out actually. So a lot more videos on that coming out. But yeah, as always, thank you so much for watching. And of course, I'll catch you in the next one. Peace out.